Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. On this month's edition of Other Voices, we're going to take a close look at the Trump regime's budget proposal sent down to Congress just last month. No one really expects this budget to pass. We certainly hope it doesn't pass. But taking a look at an administration's budget can give us some insight into their political and policy priorities. And those priorities, according to Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor, who looked through this budget and called those priorities cruel and deviant, quote unquote. It is, in short, a war on the poor and just about everybody else in this country. Joining us to talk about the budget, I'm really pleased to welcome back Jack Rasmus. Jack has a PhD in political economy. He teaches economics and politics at St. Mary's College. He's the author of numerous books. We've got a couple here and a new one coming out that we'll talk about. And Jack is the host of the weekly radio show Alternative Visions on the Progressive Radio Network. He's a frequent contributor on economic, political, and labor issues for various publications, including Z Magazine, Against the Current, In These Times, and others. And you can read his articles at his blog, jackrasmus.com. Jack, welcome back to Other Voices.
Pleasure to be back. Thank you.
Is it about your fourth or fifth time here, or something like that?
I'm not keeping count.
Whenever the economy looks shaky or something,
yeah,
economic is
about
shaky.
Every year for the last 5 years.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I'm really glad to have you here. Let's get into this budget that he sent down. As I mentioned at the outset, no hope that it's going to pass the way it is, and there's lots of reasons for that. But it's full of cuts on one side, mostly domestic social safety net side, and plenty of increases on another side, especially for the Pentagon and various military endeavors. You want to give me just kind of your capsule review of the budget, and then what I'd like to do is go through some of these specific cuts that he's proposing to get this idea of where his priorities are. But you're...
Sure. Well, since this show is about, at least in major part, the attack on the poor and everybody else, I think that addendum is very important to note. If you look at the budget, the main hammer comes down on the working poor and the non-working poor. Several, maybe 4 or 5 big programs with big cuts in them. The Medicaid cut, $800 billion over a decade. Food stamps, $193 billion of cuts. Social Security disability, another $70 billion. Other welfare programs, about $80 billion. And then you have cuts for education and housing and Planned Parenthood and so forth. If you add those up, you know, you're well over $1 trillion already, and we're not even talking about what happens when they cut off the subsidies for Obamacare, ACA, how many hundreds of billions that will be.
Yeah.
So we're well up there. Those are the major cut areas. And of course, you know, there's cuts in science, and there's cuts in the National Endowment of the Arts and so forth. But the big cuts are really aimed at the working poor. And that's the major thrust of this budget. On the other side, you know, there's a $550 billion increase for the Pentagon, right? So that's about half of the $1.2 trillion in cuts. And people aren't that much aware, but the repeal of the Obamacare, the ACA, at the heart of that will be $592 billion tax cuts for businesses and for wealthy people. That's a tax cut bill as well. So, you know, the Pentagon and the cuts for the wealthy and out of the ACA just about even out the 1.2 trillion cuts for the working poor. That's the essence of this thing. And, you know, where we haven't even talked about the cuts that will come elsewhere with you know, the ACA reduction.
Yeah, and basically when you look at where the cuts are coming from in the spending and where the tax cuts are going, which is to the wealthy, I think it's fair to say this is perhaps the biggest transfer of wealth from the poor and middle class to the wealthy perhaps in the history of this country.
Well, maybe all at once in one act, I would agree with you, but we've been having a transfer of wealth going on in this country in the trillions for years now.
Right.
It's not new.
That is why we have the problems with severe inequality that we do.
This is just the latest iteration of those massive cuts. And by the way, we haven't even mentioned the business tax cuts to $2.2 trillion on top of all this that are coming in the revenue bill that's going to follow.
That's true. Before I get into the actual budget cut areas, you mentioned the repeal of the ACA and the tax cuts for the wealthy that are part of that. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we talk about all these budgetary things, whether it's the tax bill or the budget that he's proposed, that one of the reasons they started with repeal and replace Obamacare was specifically to get those tax cuts for the wealthy done. And I think it's important for people to think of whatever the health care bill comes out looking like, and we know it's going to be a piece of crap, that it really isn't health care reform, it's a tax cut for the wealthy bill. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the essence of it. You know, all the opposition to Obamacare and ACA from business interests and you know, small businesses and so forth, Tea Partiers and all that stuff is, you know, all the other excuses they gave why they opposed it. At the heart of it, they didn't want to pay these taxes, $592 billion, $60 billion a year, roughly. You know, so and it was really taxes on the very wealthy in some cases. You know, there was a surtax for people on investments, income above a certain level, and a surtax on people on income above a certain level. So, and then there were small business taxes and so forth. This was paid for in large part by taxing the wealthy. But that's the reason why they're opposed.
To pay for the subsidies.
To pay for the subsidies.
For people who couldn't afford the full price of an insurance policy.
Right, and to enrich the health insurance companies and pharma companies.
Which is why we still have health care that's based on profit-making insurance companies selling us policies instead of a single-payer system where the subsidies don't end up in corporate pockets. So I just think it's important because, you know, the news media are constantly talking about health care reform, and it's not. It's a tax cut for the wealthy.
You don't hear enough talk about that in the regular news media. You know, once in a while you hear them talk about the tax cuts that are really part of this thing, but they should be talking about it an awful lot more. And it's just the latest in a long trend for 10, 15 years now. Just to give the audience a sense of the magnitude of the tax cuts for investors and bankers and corporations and the wealthy that's been occurring since 2001. Under George W. Bush, $3.4 trillion of tax cuts, 80% of which went to the wealthiest 20% in his first term alone. And then there was the tax repatriation bill that they're trying to repeat, bringing money from offshore. That was another $350 billion.
These are all the corporate profits that are parked offshore so that they avoid U.S. taxes.
That's right. All this talk now going on is a repeat for what happened in 2005. The same thing happened back then, and they reduced the 35% corporate tax rate to 5.25% if businesses would bring back that money they were holding offshore. Well, they brought some of it back. They were supposed to use it to hire, but they used most of it to buy up other companies and pay dividends.
And buy back their own stock.
Buy back their own stock and so forth.
There was no requirement that they invest it or expand jobs or anything.
There were no penalties if they did not. So in essence,
there was no
expectation. But that was only the Bush term, 3.6 trillion, and there were some energy tax cuts for corporations and so forth, and then 180 billion more when the crisis in 2008 hit. So with Bush, we had about $4 trillion in tax cuts. Obama comes into office and he has $300 billion, mostly business tax cuts, in his first recovery bill. And then when the recovery did not occur very, very quickly in the first 2 years, another $800 billion in 2010. And then we had, if people remember, this thing called the fiscal cliff crisis in 2012, where he simply extended the Bush tax cuts for another decade at a cost of another $5 trillion. So Bush and Obama cut taxes 80% or more going to corporations and the rich to the tune of $10 trillion. And now we got Trump coming in, who promised another $6 trillion cuts under his first term, and we're seeing at least $2.2 trillion of that being proposed here in the first year.
In the first year.
Yeah. So lots of tax cuts for businesses, lots of tax cuts for corporations, lots of tax cuts for the wealthy, but it hasn't produced very much in terms of real growth.
Yeah. You know, I was going to bring this up later, but since we're on this topic, this has been the Republican line for a long time, going back to Ronald Reagan. They call it supply-side economics, that, if I understand this right, and it's giving corporations and the wealthy more liquid capital to spend. They're supposed to go out and spend it, invest it in expanding their businesses, and therefore hiring more people, expanding jobs. Has it ever worked?
Well, there's not much empirical evidence that has ever worked. In fact, that topic is one of the central themes of my earlier book last year, which is Systemic Fragility in the Global Economy, in which I looked at the fact that we had these huge tax cuts going on, and each of these tax cuts were always worded as a job creation bill.
Yeah.
But the money has not, all the tax cut money and all the other profits have not flowed back into real investment. In other words, creating new jobs, making things.
Not building
wages,
factories.
Building,
Yeah.
tangible things. Where has all that money gone then, is the question. Well, I'll tell you, my research shows that, one, instead of flowing into real investment, it's gone into financial asset markets, stocks, bonds, derivatives, foreign exchange, and so forth, one. Or it's gone offshore into emerging markets where profits were greater, you know, in Brazil and Asia and China. Or
So foreign investment.
Foreign investment offshore, or financial
foreign jobs.
assets, right? Or it's been used to provide stock buybacks and dividend payouts, which since 2010 have amounted to $6 trillion in this country. Corporations are given $6 trillion in stock buybacks and dividend payouts to their shareholders. Or it's just being hoarded on balance sheets. There's trillions of dollars that aren't spent that corporations are just sitting on. So those four areas is where these trillions of dollars in tax cuts have gone, but they haven't gone into creating new jobs and, you know, produce. That's why we're not getting any wage growth in this country. One of the various reasons why. And they don't understand, well, why isn't it growing? You know, why are people so upset? Well, because the money is not even trickling down anymore. What we got is a financialized global economy where, if anything, you're getting drip, drip, but not trickle down.
Well put. Thank you. All right. Well, that takes care of supply-side economics. We can skip that part.
By the way, a lot of mainstream economists still believe that nonsense, you see, because their models and theories of 30, 40 years ago say that, okay, if you lower interest rates or you reduce taxes or you deregulate, all of that reduces business costs. And the assumption is, well, if you reduce business costs, the amount of reduction is going to automatically get recommitted into new investment. Well, that's not true. You know, the theory, the model is absolutely wrong. What happens with all that additional income that corporations get are the things I told you in a global financial economy.
Well, we've got this history. Are they just hoping that it'll work next time, or just flat out lying to us that this will be the effect?
Well, I think some are hoping and some know better and they're lying.
Fair enough.
I don't think you know, that the people at the central bank, the Federal Reserve, don't know what's really happening. In fact, we could talk about that later. Why did they continue to cut interest rates keep them near zero for 8 years for bankers?
And we will talk about that because your next book due out later this month, I think.
That's right.
Is on the Central Reserve and other central banks. But let's get back to the budget for now, and let's take a closer look at some of these individual cuts. Medicaid is the first one, I think, on everybody's mind. And as I understand it, the House health plan that passed the House and is
Obamacare.
yeah. No, the repeal and replace that the Republicans just recently passed and
Trump
sent over
care.
to Trump Care, yeah, or Trump Don't Care. That included $880 billion in Medicaid cuts. Is
That's correct.
somewhere around there?
880
But then Trump's budget proposes even more cuts in Medicaid. Is that right? Or are we talking about the?
No, that's the total cut in Medicaid, about $880 billion over a decade. So almost $100 billion a year. That's the cut. Now who's on Medicaid? You know, who's
That's
getting these
that
benefits?
was my next question. Who is? Obviously, you can't take almost $1 trillion out of a medical insurance system and not hurt somebody.
Yeah. Well, the people who are the beneficiaries of Medicaid are the working poor and the poor, people like single moms with children, okay, single-headed households, moms with children, people who are disabled, elderly people who are forced to retire before they can claim Medicaid. It's disabled people in general. These are the folks who are being cut here.
And people who are working but not making enough.
That's right.
To
Oftentimes, yeah. Which means, by the way, increasingly a lot of younger people, millennials, who are only able to get part-time work and can't afford to even buy something on Medicaid, you know, or excuse me, Medi-Cal, the Obamacare in California. They have to go on Medicaid. That's the only thing they've got because they can't afford the payments, even with the reimbursements, they can't afford it.
do you have a guesstimate on how many people we're talking about that are going to be affected by $880 billion in cuts? And
Yeah, so probably somewhere between 10, 20 million.
10 and 20 million.
That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. Are they? Is it their services will be reduced, or they will just no longer? There will just no longer be Medicaid for a lot of people of any sort.
They won't be reduced; they'll be eliminated.
That's
In other words,
that's the
that,
question.
They can go to emergency room and drive up the insurance costs for all the rest of us.
Yeah, yeah. That's something that seems to be forgotten is how all the pieces of this work together. You know, if you take somebody off Medicaid, somebody is still going to be paying for their medical treatment when they need it.
Or they won't get the medical treatment, and they will suffer extreme consequences.
Yeah, or we'll have a contagious disease or something that will all suffer the consequences. So anything else on the Medicaid cuts? It seems between their desire to trash health care and just cut federal spending that something like this is actually in the books or is gonna happen. It looks like now, you know, as I said, the budget proposal rarely gets past what the president sends to the Congress.
Well, I don't know. You got a Republican majority there in Congress right now, and I think a lot of this, maybe not all of it, there may be some token concessions to the Democrats, but I think a lot of this will get passed. I think people are going to be shocked when they see it. Certainly the Medicaid cuts will be passed.
Yeah,
right?
that's what I'm saying.
Certainly that. And the Social Security disability insurance, the $70 billion there, will probably pass as well. And some of the food stamp cuts will pass. Maybe not as much, but certainly a lot.
Let's talk about the Social Security disability cuts, $70 billion there. And I should remind people that Trump, in the campaign, said he wasn't going to cut Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. He's cutting Medicaid. And he's trying to say he's not cutting Social Security, but Social Security disability coverage is part of Social Security. Yeah. It's paid for by the Social Security system.
Right.
Who's affected by this? Who is on Social Security disability?
It's It's people who become fully disabled, and had paid into the Social Security system, into Medicare and Social Security system, so they are eligible for Social Security disability insurance. And we have had a surge in the number of people since 2008. So the question is why this surge in millions have gone on Social Security disability. Well, part of it is aging, the aging of the population. And part of it, though, is I think people have gone on SSDI some because unemployment insurance pays so poorly. And the duration is so short, and it only pays maybe 25% of what you were making. But SSDI, if you can go on that, it's permanent. Once you're on it, it pays better. It's greater duration. So I think working folks have found a way to use the system maybe a little bit, and that's why we see this big surge since 2008 on SSDI. But part of it is also just the aging of the population. The population increased in the last 20 years. Those going on SSDI, the percentages aren't that different.
So the people on Social Security disability insurance have not yet reached retirement age, is that right?
They may not, yes.
Yeah.
They may have been injured and can't work anymore. There's about 11 million of those people. So remember, we got 10 to 20 million people on Medicaid being cut. We got 11 million on SSDI being cut. We have 44 million people receiving food stamps nowadays, which has increased significantly as well. But that's because people just can't afford, with the lack of wage increases for a decade now. More and more people have to use food stamps.
And that's another one that's on the chopping block, about $190 billion?
$193 billion over the decade, yes.
Over the decade,
yeah.
So...
It's a big one.
Yeah, so $19 billion per year.
Right.
All these figures are 10-year figures, is that right?
Yes, the ones I've been giving you.
So when you say $70 billion for Social Security disability, that's $7 billion per year.
That's right. Yeah.
Because that's the way the budgets are presented, as in 10-year
But
chunks.
on an annual basis, it's well over $100 billion, and then you got $54 billion annually on average over 10 years going to the Pentagon in an increase, and you got about the same amount, 60 billion, in the tax cuts just from Obamacare repeal. But then you got this big tax cut bill coming behind it all as well.
Yeah, we don't even know
and who's going to pay for that? Well, I think. He promised. Trump said he wasn't going to touch Social Security and Medicare, the regular Medicare system. But I think that's coming. Certainly, Paul Ryan and the Republicans in Congress want it. They've wanted this for a long time.
For a long
time, after Social Security, Medicare. I think they've tactically decided, they can't put Social Security in this bag yet. They'll have to take a second bite of that apple 2 years down the road, maybe.
Yeah. So on the food stamps, now a lot of people, there's a lot of working people that require food stamps because they don't make enough. This seems like a lot of Trump voters, one might assume. How many people are going to be affected by the food stamp cuts?
Well, there are 44 million people on food stamps. 44 million in this country. So, you're talking probably at least 20 million people, perhaps. The details on how they're going to make these cuts have not been defined yet.
Yeah.
It's purposely.
We need to keep in mind the budget is a broad picture of where they're headed. Would this tighten requirements and knock a bunch of people off the food stamp rolls?
Altogether, yes.
So that's part of it, and reduce.
Reduction, yes.
So how much does an average person get who's getting food stamps? How much help toward buying food for their family each month does this amount to?
Some families are really dependent on food stamps. If you're making minimum wage, $8-9 an hour, and you have a couple of children and so forth, there's no way you can make ends meet, especially in California.
Yeah.
Without food stamps, you're going to go hungry.
But how much would it be?
It varies state by state.
Yeah.
I can't give you a figure per family, what the cuts would be, but
Because the states get this in block
Yeah,
grants,
that's
and,
right.
and so they figure out how
the
to do
states can manipulate how they distribute it.
it. Yeah. Okay, so another, what do we get? I'm losing track of how many tens of millions of people are going to be hurt by this budget.
Well, 44 million potentially on food stamps. 11 million people potentially
Medicaid.
SSDI.
Or SSDI.
Medicaid, 10 to 20 million more. There's a little bit overlapping on some of this, of course. You've got housing assistance reductions, Section 10 and so forth. You've got education reductions. K through 12, about $1 billion in cuts there, while, by the way, they passed $500 million for charter schools. So they're taking money out of K through 12 and they're giving it to charter schools.
Uh-huh.
They're going to discontinue the debt forgiveness program for college students. There was in the $1.3 trillion total college student debt. There was a provision that if you went to work for nonprofits or the government or something over 10 years, you would have some of that forgiven. Well, that's been wiped out. You're going to have to pay now. And some other...
Even if you're working for a high-paying nonprofit
Yeah.
social justice organization.
You got any debts?
Let's move on. Another one that's on the chopping block is the earned income tax credit. And this is important to a lot of people, a lot of working families.
Working
Yes.
poor. I mean, again, well, what do we mean when we say working poor? It depends the cost of living and where you live, but generally you can assume if you're making $30,000 or less a year, you're in the category of working poor, right? And it may sound like a lot of money, and maybe it is in Tupelo, Mississippi, but it's not in the Bay Area.
No, it's certainly
right?
not.
I mean,
Would you say 30,000 or under?
I would say, that's my rough guesstimate.
Yeah.
But, you would think that if you were making $15 an hour, you wouldn't be working poor. Well, in California, you are working poor. Officially, the poverty line, California, I think, is like 26 or 28, maybe a little less, thousand a year for a family of four, right? But that's an underestimate. It really should be higher, particularly since in the last year or so we've had this outrageous rent cost escalation problem going on in California and other problems, with cost of living. The cost of living is not accurately reflective of the true cost of living.
Yeah. How frequently do they recalculate things like the poverty line and, cost of living? I know they do it every year because a lot of wages are based on cost of living increases, and we've helped pass minimum wage increases in 5 different cities around here, and they all are tied to the local cost of living, and that's calculated annually. But things like the poverty line, when they're trying to decide, who gets into a program, how often is that recalculated?
Well, that's usually done by the Census Bureau, and of course we take a census every 10 years,
Yeah.
right? So that's not updated frequently enough. There are some, if Congress passes a law, they can go ahead and do another estimate. But it varies. Sometimes it's annual, based on the cost of living. But poverty figures are not done annually. And of course they vary by the cost of living. But it depends what price index you're going to use, you see.
Yeah.
I mean, there's at least a half a dozen different price indexes that you can use, and none of them are really truly accurate.
Yeah, it's like the weather. There's all these microclimates around, and
well, there's a lot of assumptions that go into statistics. It's not really the hard data. It's a statistic, which means it's an estimate of reality, and the assumptions you use will determine what kind of estimate you get.
Yeah, as Mark Twain said, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. Let's talk about the internal math of the budget. Now that we've seen some of the major, let's talk about the increases first, and then I want to talk about the internal math. So the first thing is a big defense spending increase. What was that, 500 billion for
$54 billion a year.
a year?
On
540.
average,
Yeah.
Whether it's front-loaded or back-loaded, I'm not sure. It's not clear because there's not enough details. But that's just the Pentagon budget, you see.
Yeah.
That's not total defense war spending in this country.
Right.
The Pentagon budget is, roughly $650 billion a year. But there are a lot of other defense war expenses that aren't in the Pentagon budget, like Homeland Security is over $50 billion a year.
And there's a big,
not there.
big increase for them coming.
Yes, and all the fuel that the military uses is in the energy budget. It's not in that budget. Of course, the veterans costs, that we're still paying from Vietnam still, and others building up of all these years, those are costs that are there.
And they're under the VA budget, not the
right.
Pentagon.
All the
nuclear weapons are under
nuclear-
the Energy Department, not the
right.
Pentagon.
That's right. So they have a lot of cubby holes where they put, and then there's like a $75 billion a year black budget.
Yeah.
In other words, these are secret new weapons developments, and only a few people in Congress actually know what these are and what the actual spending is. That does not show up in printed form anywhere.
Yeah.
So we're really at least $900 billion a year. And we don't know what increases are going there. We hear Trump's talking about renovating the nuclear arsenal, how much that's going to cost and what that's going to be. We just don't know. So there's a lot of, line items that are in the appendix that we don't know what they are.
And a few billion for the wall is in this budget. Is that correct?
Yeah, a few billion for a wall that probably won't get built.
Yeah. And how is Mexico going to donate to our budget to pay for this wall? Have they outlined a plan yet?
I don't know. Maybe he'll send them a letter and say, please pay here by this date or else. I don't know.
So huge cuts in social programs that actually benefit people, huge increases in military hardware and so-called security,
And what people should
and a
realize,
fantasy wall.
what people should realize is that what's the effect on the general economy of taking $100 to $150 billion out of the economy every year, and the multiplier effect of that, which is probably about $300 billion. You cut $300 billion out of government spending. Effect on GDP, the economy, how is that going to reverberate to everybody else?
That's right.
It will have an effect.
Yeah. Food stamps, even though they are food stamps, they are money that the grocery stores to the tune of $190 billion are not going to be getting over the next 10 years. It won't be spent at their stores.
And they are all spent. Food stamps are all spent.
Yeah.
Tax cuts are not all invested.
That's right.
Especially if it goes to businesses and investors.
The wealthier the recipient of the tax cut, the less likely they are to spend it on something.
Yeah, or the more likely they may spend it on financial investments that don't do anything for the economy, or send it offshore somewhere and help somebody else's economy.
Or like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is money in the pocket of the working poor who are going to go out and spend it because they need that cash. That all comes out of our general economy.
That's right.
That's an important point to keep in mind.
And the economy is beginning to show some signs of soft spots right now. We can talk about that later. If you wish.
We will. I do want to get to the general economic outlook while I have you here, but let's just quickly hit the internal math on this budget, because with all their great fanfare introducing and everything, it doesn't actually add up, does it?
No, as a number of others have pointed out, there's some funny double counting going on in this. Just to give you one example, Trump has proposed to totally eliminate the inheritance tax, which brings hundreds of billions of dollars here into government tax revenues. But yet in the budget, he's indicating that by eliminating that tax, it's going to increase the revenue from that tax by several $100 billion. Well, how you cut something out totally and then get more revenue from it, is a little bit of a...
I saw that online somewhere where in one section of the budget they had, the repeal of the tax. And then another side where they're trying to balance everything, they're showing income from the estate tax to balance off the income side of it.
That's only one of the more glaring examples of that.
Right.
But, it's accounting ledger domain.
And then there's this famous $2 trillion that gets counted twice. What's that all about? Or got counted twice?
I'm not sure what the $2 trillion is. That's about what the tax cut.
$2 billion, maybe.
Oh, $2 billion?
I forget. But that's what it was related to, was the counting the estate tax twice.
Oh, no. Estate tax twice is, we're talking about hundreds of billions.
Oh, okay.
That's a big item, a big revenue item. From those whose estates, when they pass away, are worth 14, 15 million or more, which is something like 1/4% of all the households.
Yeah.
So it only affects the very, very super rich, you see.
And when they talk about this, they inevitably talk about family farmers who want to pass the farm on to their children. It really tugs at the heartstrings, but that's not really who we're talking about.
No, it's not at all.
There aren't many family farmers who are making $14 million a year or leaving $14 million to their families. The budget projects a lot of their figures based on a certain growth rate of the gross domestic product. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Yes, well, that's one of the more ridiculous assumptions in this budget. Trump is estimating that the U.S. Economic growth in GDP terms, real GDP terms, will be 3 to 3.5%. Well, we haven't seen that for decades. 3.5% growth. We've been barely growing by about 1.7, 1.8% here since 2008. And it doesn't look like with collapsing investment and collapsing productivity, that's going to change very much for years going on. The new normal is maybe at best 1.5%, although they do say we're growing at 2%, but that has to do with changing the definitions of GDP that happened a few years ago, which I don't accept. So that's about $500 billion extra that's been put into GDP since 2013 that I don't think should be there. So the growth is really about 1.6, 1.7. Well, he's saying we're going to grow 3.5. How's that going to happen?
Right.
Well, only if you fudge around with the numbers.
He needs it to grow 3.5% to make his budget make any sense. And they claim it's going to happen because the tax cuts to the corporations will go out and, like they've never done before, this time they're really going to spend it on new investment in real things.
Right.
Yeah.
This time.
This time.
This time it'll work, even though it hasn't for 30 years.
Okay. All right, let me bring the audience into this. If those of you who have been here before, you need to hold up your hand and wait for Crystal to arrive with the microphone. And if you do have a question, if you would stand up and make it a little easier on our camera operators. And anybody in the audience? No questions yet? Budgets always bring out the best in people. There you go.
Hi, my question is about Trump's negotiating history. I was assuming that what he's doing, or him or his advisors, with this outlandish budget is just a first bid, and then they figure they'll negotiate back and forth, and then they'll have something that's not quite as bad in the final result. And then everybody will say, oh, well, isn't that great? It's not as bad as we thought it was going to be.
Is that true? It's just a negotiating tactic? He's surely assured us many a time what a great negotiator he is.
Well, you got to understand what Trump is. Trump is a multi-billionaire real estate wheeler dealer, commercial property wheeler dealer. And the way these guys operate, their modus operandi, is to put out a ridiculous position and to shock your opponent into thinking this guy's crazy, this is going to be a very difficult and tough negotiation. And then he backs off of it once they get into the heart of negotiation. And people, his adversaries think, oh, wow, we got him to back off. We're winning. This is time and again since he's been in office. You can see this in foreign policy. You can see this in economics and a whole number of other areas. This is the way he operates. Now it's causing a lot of people heartburn who aren't used to that kind of behavior. We see this with the Europeans now, for example, and they're really looking elsewhere in terms of alliances and so forth, because this guy is a bull in a china shop, and they're not used to dealing with real estate speculators like him. So there's a real clash among the global ruling elites here going on. This is a new approach, a totally different way of coming at it, and he's really alienating a lot of people economically as well as politically, and that will probably have a net negative effect on the U.S. economy going forward.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind another aspect of a big difference between deal making or negotiating in the business world and deal making or negotiating in the foreign policy or even the political world with Congress. That in the business world, if you can't come to an agreement on the terms that you like, as a business person, you can walk away. You can just walk away from the deal. You can't do that when you're talking arms reductions or budgets with Congress. You know, he's now the President of the United States, and he can't walk away from any deals. He doesn't have that final leverage that any business person would have, is that you don't like my final terms, I'll go find somebody else to build the hotel with. That doesn't work in the political world.
Well, you can see it with negotiating the free trade agreements. He first came out and he said, we're going. Well, he ran on the program. We're going to get rid of NAFTA and so forth and these trade deals. And when he first came into office, he did some harsh things in communication with some of our trading partners, Mexico and even China and so forth. And then, of course, he backs off of it. And as I've always said and been writing, he's a free trader. He believes in free trade. He just doesn't believe in the existing multilateral free trade agreements. He wants to renegotiate them on a bilateral case-by-case basis and get a little bit better deal for American corporations. It sounds like he's totally against it, but again, this is the way he operates. What he's really doing is trying to soften up his opposition and come away with a piece of a gain. But you can't do that, as you say, in the world of politics and international nuclear peace negotiations and so forth. You're certainly not going to do it with the North Koreans. They're going to take you for your word, and you just may provoke them to do something stupid. The danger of Trump is that he's provocative, and that does not work well when you're the United States and you've got this global responsibility, this global world that you're operating within. You just may cause an accident, a political accident.
Yeah. Well, I think the recent thing with the Paris Climate Accords is a good example. I mean, he did walk away from the Paris Agreement, but you can't really walk away from climate change. You're not negotiating with something, that can change its position.
Well, once again, I think that's his initial position. The U.S. cannot pull out of it for 4 years.
Right.
I think we're going to renegotiate it, right? He's walking away, but they'll have to come back to renegotiate something and improve the U.S. Position in the whole deal. Again, this is the way commercial real estate realtor dealers operate.
Yeah, but the Paris Agreement didn't even really work that way. It's each country brought its own proposal to the table, and there was nothing signed off, and there wasn't a lot of back and forth. It was kind of peer pressure to get each country to bring the best they could offer to the table.
But it was a cheap domestic political victory with his base.
Yeah.
To walk away from it.
Absolutely.
Because he hasn't really delivered very much for that base
No.
in the last 100+ days. So this is a cheap, easy way to say to his base, look what I'm doing. I'm doing what I said I would do. I'm not bringing the jobs back that I said I was doing. I'm not building the wall. I'm not really stopping the immigration, but I'm doing this.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a question down front here, and then we'll follow up over there. Right down front here. Crystal, if you would.
Well, getting back to the war on the poor, I'm not real sure that the budget that, or the piece of paper basically that the administration has presented as its budget is going to give us a very clear picture of where they're going to end up some months hence. But I was curious to know, you've gone to the trouble of writing another book. I'd like to hear some more about what you're addressing in that book, and if to some extent it is a suggestion of an alternative approach that we should be pressing for. It's very depressing to hear about this Republican war on the poor. How should we be organizing to oppose it?
Excellent question. That's the kind of question we like around here. And then we'll talk about your new book.
Well, my new book is really focusing on the monetary policy side of the central bank, and asking some questions that aren't being asked, I don't think, like why is it that we've had 8 years of near zero interest rates for bankers? The banks were bailed out within a year. By 2010, they were bailed out. Since 2010, profits have more than doubled. As I said before, $6 trillion in payouts to shareholders have occurred. Why 8 years of zero free money, in other words, for the bankers and investors? That's cost over $1 trillion in retirees' losses of fixed income. So you've got $1 trillion in the retirees, some of them who are the poor,
Yeah.
or near poor, right? Who make nothing now on their savings accounts and their CDs, but that low interest rates for 8 years have caused a real flush of profits for the bankers and the investors. So you're actually taking $1 trillion from grandma and grandpa, and you're giving it to the bankers. Why did we go on so long with that? And of course, then your question is, how do we change that? Well, in the book, Central Bankers at the End of Their Ropes, I end up the book with some proposals on how to restructure not only the banking system, but the Federal Reserve, the central bank, so that the Federal Reserve is not in the pocket of the private banks, which it is, ultimately, and I show how it is. And how do we make the central bank democratic and accountable for the rest of us? Because you have to have a central bank, but the question is, who does it serve? Whose interests? So there are some very specific structural reforms that I'm proposing in that book. As far as the reforms that must occur on the fiscal side, not the monetary side, that I truly believe is going to take a political party realignment in this country. I really don't think you're going to be able to reform the Democratic Party, and I know a lot of people watching this are going to be upset with that statement. I certainly welcome them to try. Bernie Sanders is trying very hard, but he's not getting very far. I think a transformation occurred in the Democratic Party under the Democratic Leadership Conference in the early 90s, and it was captured by money interests. And it's not the Democratic Party of my youth or my grandfather's youth. It's not the party of FDR anymore.
No.
This is a new animal. And
the Republican Party is a new animal when you get down to it. And it seems like both parties have drifted away from the people they're supposed to be representing.
or lured away with a lot of money.
Yeah. Lured away rather than
Lured
drifted.
away.
Yes,
Citizens United and all the rest. Yes.
You're an old union guy. You were a local president, and you've done a lot of work with unions. What kind of power do they have on these questions anymore?
Virtually none.
Yeah.
Virtually none. In my youth, the unions still had some influence on the economy and on the politics. But since the 1980s, it's been a steady decline, and the unions are just a shell of what they were in the private sector. Only 6% roughly of that sector is unionized. It used to be 35%, and in certain industries, manufacturing 70, 80%, trucking, it's just not there anymore. The neoliberal offensive, beginning with Ronald Reagan, really went after the unions, and it succeeded.
Yeah.
And now, of course, they're going after the public sector unions as the last vestige.
That's about all that's left.
That's about all that's left. And as the unions have gotten weaker, they have attempted to ally themselves more and more, I think, with the Democratic Party. But as they got weaker, the Democratic Party felt it didn't have to deliver, because you're not delivering. You know, why do we have to give you anything? Only when you're strong will we give you something.
Yeah.
So it's a self-fulfilling decline.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure exactly what the answer is, but it's pretty clear that the lack of real wage growth since 2008 has a lot to do with the decline and destruction of the unions.
Yeah.
Because every time we had a recession, in the recovery from the recession, the unions were able to get the wages and benefits back up during the recovery. Well, if you don't have unions, you can't get that union wage differential and that, that wage recovery, so you end up with stagnant wages, as we have had for the last 8 years.
All right. Question over here. Take the mic and hold it right up there.
Okay. I was interested in your discussion about the Trump budget kind of in historical context. I wonder if you could expand on that. The Trump budget may be a symptom of something that's been going on a long time, not just in the United States, in other words, cutting welfare programs, but in Europe. In Europe, with left-wing parties, social democratic, socialist, quote, unquote, parties have been cutting welfare programs in Europe for a number of years. This has been going on in the United States, even with Democratic-Republican coalitions, such as under the Clinton administration, cutting welfare programs. So we have a bipartisan agreement at these top levels of these parties, the top level, to cut social welfare programs. And I wonder if you could say, given this phenomenon is worldwide, could you connect it to the crisis, growing crisis of the world capitalist economy, leading the power elite, the capitalist-controlled governments to cut social welfare and cut taxes, of course, and up military budgets?
Well, in my earlier book last year, Systemic Fragility in the Global Economy,
Which is right here, by the way. And these are available at Jack's website, jackrasmus.com. You can find out how to get them there. These are both last year, right? And Looting
yes,
Greece.
right.
And the new one coming out is called Central Bankers on the Ropes.
Right.
There, I got the plug in for you. Now go ahead and
you.
answer the question.
Well, to understand it historically, what you're talking about is, why do we see fiscal austerity everywhere? Governments everywhere adopting fiscal austerity. In other words, cut spending on social programs, privatize whatever national public works and public goods there were, and all the elements of fiscal austerity. We're seeing this everywhere. We're seeing it because we have an ascendance of monetary policy. Monetary policy is in the driver's seat and has been, at least for a decade and a half now. And what that means is that the central bank and the banks are driving the so-called recovery. And of course, if they're in the driver's seat, driving the recovery, they're going to take care of themselves first, which they have done quite nicely. The thing about monetary policy and central banking is that if you've got the approach through cutting interest rates and quantitative easing and all these other ways of throwing massive liquidity at the banks and at corporations, if that's your approach, you don't want fiscal spending to occur because it might negate that approach. So what you do is put a lid on fiscal spending or cut fiscal spending, austerity, in order to maximize the monetary policy approach to stimulate. The essence of the central bank monetary policy is, and the chairs Bernanke and Yellen have sort of admitted this even, what you do is pump all this liquidity into the banking system and the economy to raise financial asset prices, stock prices, bond prices, and so forth, to make that sector super rich in the hopes that they would then spend some of that huge profitability on real investment. A lot of it's going to go into stocks and bonds and offshore and so forth, but the hope was, you know, they'll have so much that they will have to spend on real investment and real jobs and productivity and so forth. That's the whole strategy behind central banking, the monetarist approach in Europe, in Japan, and in the US. It's all the same. And that's why you see different degrees of fiscal austerity in all these places in order to not have government spending interrupt or somehow prevent this monetary approach to recovery. They knew this recovery would take a long time. I mean, Bernanke has even admitted it, and so has Yellen, the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank, that they knew when they did this back in 2008, it would be a very slow recovery.
And we're still in the recovery.
And we're still very slow.
Yeah.
Right? But that's the historical context of this. Somewhere in the last 20 years, we've had this financialization of the global economy and the rise of a new finance capital elite that I talk about in this book, a global finance capital elite, shadow banks and securities of various kinds and liquid financial markets. And they're not only in the driver's seat in the economy, their super wealth has allowed them, I believe, to capture the political system as well, to make sure that the governments pursue a central bank monetary policy and not a fiscal policy.
And we're going to have to leave it there because we're all out of time. My guest has been Jack Rasmus, political economist, author of Looting Greece, Systemic Fragility in the Global Economy, and the forthcoming Central Bankers on the Ropes. You've been watching Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. Next month, we're going to talk about resistance, California style. A lot of exciting stuff happening up in Sacramento. Jack, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Audience, thank you for being here.
By the way, I have copies if anyone wants to buy them at this time.